going to be making the 2-inch finished half square triangles using triangles on a roll, and this makes 800. So I've cut some fabric strips 6.5 inches wide by the width of fabric in order to prepare for this size. The package will tell you what size strips you need to cut. Now, instead of dealing with the total width of fabric to make it more manageable under the machine, I'm going to just cut these strips in half right where my fold line is still present, because I won't be using every, fraction of an inch of this fabric. There'll still be some left over, but this will be more manageable to work with under the machine. So I'm going to do that with all my strips, and my fabric has already been pressed, and I've used best press on it. So however you might pre-treat your fabric, you want to do that ahead of time. So when you first open your triangles on a roll, there's a little bit of glue that holds it down, and I don't want to use those ones. And so you can either trim directly on the next solid line, or if you like to give yourself a little space, you can trim a bit away. Now, if this wasn't the beginning and I wanted to use this set of triangles here, then I'd want to trim directly on the line. But if you trim a little away from the line, you're going to lose the triangles on the left here. So that's up to you, but again, there should be this makes 800, so up to you if you want to be very precise or cut a little extra. So next I'm going to take my 2 fabrics that are going to make up the half square triangles, and I'm going to put them right sides together. So these are those half width of fabric strips, and I will put the selvage ends together on one side. So I have them right sides together. So this one's a little hard to see, but I have a dot here with the print facing the other printed side. And I want to line them up as straight as possible. And if they're different fabric lines, they might not line up exactly. There might be one strip that's longer than the other. And I will put, if there is any difference, which there really isn't on this one, because they're both tilde prints, but I would put the extra length toward the selvage end. Now, depending on which fabric you want to press toward, that one should be on the bottom. So usually you press toward the dark fabric, and so I'm going to have my darker fabric on the bottom and the lighter fabric on top. But if you didn't want to do that, whichever one you want to press toward, press your half square triangles toward, will go on the bottom. So then I'm going to take my triangular paper here, and I'll leave a little bit extra on the ends here in case there's any wiggling, and I'm just going to unroll until I can fit a whole one on this strip. So I'm just kind of peeling it, and I think this line here is where I can stop because I can't fit another set of triangles. So I'm going to take my ruler and move my fabric out of the way. And this time, if I don't want to waste any, I want to cut directly on the line. So I'm going to try it that way now. And cut directly on the line, because these solid lines determine the size of your triangles. Okay, and then just roll this up and put it away for now. Now, something else to note. Let's see if we can show this. So between every solid line here, you're going to get 4 triangles. So when you cut along this diagonal line here, you're going to get 1, 2 triangles. And here's another 1, 2 triangles. So if you're trying to figure out how many of these you need, just know that every, we'll call them rows here, gives you 4 triangles. So this would be 4, here'd be another 8, 12, and so on. Turn it this way with the non-selvage end toward the top here. Okay, so I'm gonna just center my paper, and you have about a 1/4 inch on each side. Again, for some wiggle room, I'm gonna give myself about a 1/4 inch on the top as well. And then you can pin or clip your paper to the 2 pieces of fabric, just to keep it from moving while you're sewing. And just keep double checking as you go that your sides, the edges of your fabric are aligned. So that should be good. And I have a little bit left over at the bottom here with the selvages. Alright, so I'm going to take it to the machine next, and what I will do is, it doesn't matter which line I start with, but you're going to sew along the dotted lines and follow the arrows. And so, like if I start with this one here, let's zoom in, I'll start just a little into my fabric, and then I'll stitch along the dotted line following the arrows. I'll stitch a little out into the fabric, come around and stitch down the dotted line again all the way down, and I'll just keep zigzagging following the dotted lines. Then I'll turn the bundle and go the other way. But just make sure you're sewing on the dotted lines, and because you want to perforate the paper more so it tears easily, you can reduce your stitch length. I'd say probably a 1.5 stitch length, just like you would use for foundation paper piecing. This feels a little thinner than the copier paper that I use, so maybe I'd use 1.6 or 1.7. But you'd want something that has smaller stitches so that it's poking more holes along the dotted line, making it easier to tear. So let's go ahead and take this to the machine and you can see what that looks like. You'll want to select a foot that gives you a nice clear view so you can see the dotted lines approaching. So a foot like this would work well. It has that window there where you can see, or even the quilting foot. This is the one I typically use to get my 1/4 inch seam. There's this open gap here that would allow me to see the lines approaching. So whatever you find easiest to use and see those lines would be a good foot to use. before you do any cutting on the solid lines, you just want to double check that you sewed along all the dotted lines and didn't miss any. You can see some of the dotted lines turned and didn't run off the fabric, and then others did. You'd run off and go over and around. So there's kind of a mix of those lines that would zigzag, but just double check that there are stitches on all the dotted lines. Now, to make this more manageable for what I can film, I'm going to just cut off a square here, trimming on the solid line. And I want to be careful with these vertical and horizontal solid lines because they do impact the size of my half square triangles. The diagonal lines are part of seam allowance, so not as critical to get exact, but I'm just going to cut off the extra fabric first. And you can do this for the whole strip. So I'm just cutting along the horizontal and vertical lines first after I've trimmed off any excess fabric around the sides. And then I can do the diagonal lines. So trim off excess, then horizontal and vertical solid lines are cut, followed by diagonal. And the diagonal lines are just seam allowance, so if you're not exactly on that line, that's not as big of a deal. But if you are off on the vertical or horizontal lines, those ones affect the size of the half square triangle. So you do want to be as precise as you can. So this one I did a few more, just as many as you can fit comfortably on your cutting board. But what's important is you do the horizontal and vertical lines first and the diagonals last, because you want to get those accurate. So missed a little spot right here. So that half with the fabric strip that I started with yielded 28 of these half square triangles. So when it's time to press your half square triangles, I like to start with the non-paper side on top, which is most likely your darker fabric. I just give it a press to set the seam there, and then peel it open. And normally with seams along the diagonal like this, you'd have to worry about warping the fabric or stretching it too much, but because it's attached to the paper, you don't have to be as concerned about that. So just give it a press and then trim off the dog ears. And the last step is remove the paper. So just like with the foundation paper piecing tutorial I had, you don't want to start at the edges. You might tear the stitches out doing that. So I like to start somewhere in the middle of the paper, use my finger pressure to just pull straight down, and then pull toward the outer edges. And you can do that to the other side too. Just hold down the paper and tear toward the outer edge. And then at this point, the little skinny seam allowance paper should just lift right out like that. So you have a nice, accurate half square triangle. There are, of course, other methods for making half square triangles, and I've actually made a video a while ago showing other methods that just involve rulers, rotary cutters, nothing fancy. The methods just depend on how many you want to make at once, and so you might check that out. I'll link that if you're interested in seeing other ways, but this was a newer method that I tried thanks to a project by Karen Montgomery that I'm working on, and so she had lots of great tips for how to use these papers, and just made me want to try this method. So I'll show the project that I'm making these half square triangles for in a later video, but I just figured while I'm making them, might as well do a little tutorial on how to use them, since I just found this a really enjoyable method. But I really appreciate you watching, and I hope you found it helpful if you've never used them before and have been curious about them. As always, I appreciate when you like and subscribe, and I can't wait to show you what this will become, all these little triangles. So I will see you next time. Take care.